In mid-June 1864, US Grant pinned Robert E. Lee into the Petersburg defenses. With its greatest army effectively neutralized, the Confederacy was in dire straits, yet far from finished. The armies, still able to maneuver in other theaters, launched increasingly desperate offensives to reverse the rebellion's falling fortunes. It was one final desperate grasp at victory. It would all fail miserably, and by winter, Confederate military power was spent, signaling the beginning of the war's endgame. Welcome to our video on the Confederacy's final offensives, in which Confederate armies will threaten Washington, D.C., Kansas City, and Nashville before losing everything. Do you know why thousands of people on YouTube and Patreon support us financially? Because they get history you won't find anywhere else. We release 3 new exclusive videos every week. Plus, they get perks like early access to all videos, voting rights on upcoming series and videos, access to our private Discord, our production schedule, and much more. Right now, 250 exclusive episodes are waiting for members and patrons, including from our series on the Eastern Front of World War II, Spanish War of Succession, the Punic Wars, the Pacific War, the Iberian Reconquista, the Russian Revolution and Civil War, the North African and Italian campaigns of World War II, Sicilian Wars between the Greeks and Carthaginians, and many others. By joining, you're not only unlocking rare content, you're also supporting the stories you love. Your help allows us to keep producing 3 free videos per week while paying our team competitive salaries and growing the channel. Join via the links in the description, the pinned comment, or by pressing the join button under the video. Thanks for making this possible. Had the Army of the James boldly attacked, as ordered on June 9th, the thinly held Petersburg defenses would have crumbled. PGT Beauregard's reputation as a siege engineer was well deserved, and his fortifications were murderous, but he had too few troops to hold the line against a determined foe. Grant ordered another attack on June 15th, which successfully breached the defenses, but the Army of the James's timid officers allowed the attack to wither and withdrew. Grant sent in the better-led Army of the Potomac, but it was too late. Lee arrived with reinforcements and repelled every attack, until Grant reluctantly gave up on June 18th and settled in for a siege. Despite the press characterizing him as a butcher, Grant cared deeply for his soldiers' well-being. He simply understood that fighting a war meant killing soldiers, and camp diseases were far, far deadlier than bullets. Consequently, Grant would rather have risked his men in battle trying to win than let them waste away from dysentery in camp. Siege camps were especially deadly, but Grant saw no alternative. Across the lines, Lee feared siege warfare even more than his opponent. The Army of Northern Virginia's ethos was fast maneuvers and bold attacks. The static fighting during the Overland Campaign had already degraded morale, and being forced into siege trenches made it crater. Worse, Lee knew a battle of attrition was unwinnable. There was no relief army coming, and he would have to break the siege himself, but a direct breakout was impossible given Grant's entrenchments and superior numbers. Worse, Lee had another front to worry about. After humiliating Franz Sigel, the Shenandoah Valley's defenders believed the threat was gone, and mostly left to reinforce Lee. However, Sigel's replacement, David Hunter, restarted the campaign. By early June, he'd defeated the valley's remaining defenders and pushed south, ransacking Confederate farmland. Shenandoah was Virginia's breadbasket, and with supply lines to the Carolinas and Georgia stretched or cut, it was Richmond's last reliable food source. Lee was therefore compelled to dispatch 8,000 men under Jubal Early to stop Hunter. However, this provided an unexpected opportunity. Hunter's supply lines had been effectively severed by John Mosby's cavalry. He expected resupply and reinforcement from Philip Sheridan's cavalry, but Sheridan failed to arrive following the Battle of Trevilian Station. Hunter unsuccessfully probed Early's defenses around Lynchburg for 2 days. Almost out of ammunition and with no hope of resupply, Hunter withdrew. Since he couldn't fight Early, Hunter made the tactically reasonable but strategically disastrous decision to march into West Virginia rather than back up the valley to Harper's Ferry. The shorter distance meant he'd be back in action sooner, but also meant that only the Harper's Ferry garrison stood between Early and Washington. Lee swiftly ordered Early to invade Maryland to force Grant to dispatch troops to man Washington's defenses, weakening the siege. Lee vainly hoped that panicked politicians would force Grant's whole army to leave Virginia to defend them. Early's 16,000 troops bypassed Harper's Ferry and were in Maryland by July 5th. Early decided to march directly for Washington, his precise intentions unclear. The alert was raised on June 29th, when the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad reported disruptions along its line, and Grant dispatched James Ricketts's division from the 6th Corps to reinforce Harper's Ferry, but he wasn't worried. The 3 Union departments in Maryland and southern Pennsylvania should be enough to deal with Early. However, only one department actually responded. Lew Wallace was charged with defending Baltimore with the 8th Corps, which consisted of 2,500 volunteers and temporarily activated militia. After the B&O alert, Wallace realized that Early might be moving against Washington or Baltimore. The logical route to either city required the bridges at Monocacy Junction, so he moved out to block Early on July 3rd. Knowing he couldn't stop Early, Wallace built blockhouses to protect the crossings and delay him long enough for Grant to respond. His scouts found Early on July 7th, and Wallace passed their warning to Grant, who dispatched the rest of the 6th and part of the 19th Corps to reoccupy Washington's defenses, including the heavy artillery regiments he'd converted into infantry. This achieved Lee's strategic goal, but the situation at Petersburg remained unchanged. Unable to reach Harper's Ferry, Ricketts agreed to join Wallace on July 8th, bringing the force up to 5,800. Between 0900 and 1000, Early unsuccessfully attacked the defenses at the Baltimore Turnpike and the B&O Railway Bridge. Believing that he faced the entire 6th Corps and further frontal attacks were pointless, Early sent his cavalry south to find a ford and flank the Union line. Ricketts could clearly see the movement from the heights, while the Confederates couldn't see the Federal position. Consequently, after successfully fording, the Confederates were surprised by Ricketts's veterans hiding along a fence line behind rolling hills and were repulsed by a single volley. Early sent an infantry division to reinforce the cavalry, and superior numbers caused Ricketts's line to collapse. Under heavy artillery fire, the overwhelmed Federals withdrew towards the National Road, then back towards Baltimore. Early attempted but missed engaging the Union rearguard at 1800, having won the ground but lost an entire day's marching. Early reached the outskirts of Washington midday on July 11th, just as Federal troops were reoccupying the defenses. Wallace's goal was achieved, helped by the intense summer heat, which caused Early's column to string out. As both forces concentrated, the Union heavy artillery in Fort Stevens destroyed any outbuilding the Confederates could use for cover. At 1500, Early began probing Fort Stevens's outlying trenches to little effect. At some point, President Lincoln arrived to observe the fighting from the ramparts, becoming the only US president to be fired upon by enemy soldiers while in office. The rest of the Federal troops arrived during the night. Morning skirmishes made clear that Early couldn't break through, but he didn't withdraw until the Federals successfully counterattacked at 1700. Early retreated into Virginia the next day and was ineffectively pursued. Jurisdictional disputes impeded Union command, and Early was able to escape back into Shenandoah, where he first shook and then counterattacked his pursuers before reinvading Pennsylvania and burning Chambersburg. This proved to be a fatal mistake. Grant was already irritated by the various commands' failure to defeat Early, and allowing him into Pennsylvania was the final straw. Grant combined all local departments into the Army of Shenandoah under Philip Sheridan to prevent further disputes. Grant wanted Sheridan's aggression and needed to separate Sheridan and Meade's tempers. Grant's orders were simple: destroy Early and burn the Shenandoah Valley. Nothing useful was to survive, whether the owners were Unionist or secessionist. Depending on your definition, Winchester had changed hands 11 to 75 times during this war, and Grant wanted the next time to be the final. He was over Shenandoah Valley. Sheridan happily complied. Early was expected to easily defeat Sheridan by emulating his mentor Stonewall Jackson's 1862 rapid maneuvers and surprise attacks along internal lines. However, this was 1864, and he wasn't facing green soldiers and unqualified generals. Sheridan aggressively drove his 40,000 veterans south in mid-August, burning everything he didn't carry off. Early repeatedly attacked, using the valley's geography to hide his movements, but neither Sheridan nor his men flinched. Sheridan then counterattacked and drove Early aside before continuing south, scorching the valley. Early tried one last surprise attack at Cedar Creek on October 19th. His pre-dawn assault successfully routed Sheridan's forces, but rather than pursue as ordered, his starving troops fell out to desperately plunder supplies. This allowed Sheridan to rally his men and counterattack at 1600, shattering Early's army and bolstering Lincoln's re-election. Sheridan completed his mission in mid-November and rejoined Grant. Early's army drifted apart due to desertion, and Lee draining units to shore up the Petersburg defenses. By March 1865, he only had 1,500 soldiers left, who were annihilated by George Custer at Waynesboro. Lee always defended Early's conduct, but Richmond scapegoated him. Early never held another command. Far to the west, another hopeless invasion sputtered out. Even before Vicksburg fell, the Trans-Mississippi Department was strategically irrelevant, and its commander, Edmund Kirby Smith, knew it. His 30,000 soldiers were insufficient to challenge federal control over most of his department. Missouri had been lost after Pea Ridge, while West Texas was abandoned, and all of the important parts of Arkansas and Louisiana fell during 1862. Smith's only communication with Richmond was occasional messages smuggled past the Union Navy's Mississippi gunboats, always containing unrealistic orders. He was effectively the only Confederate authority west of Mississippi, and many called his department the Kingdom of Smith, or Kirby Smithdom. Smith embraced the role, engaging in diplomacy with both Mexican and French officials, while encouraging smuggling across the Rio Grande. Smith primarily used the smuggled supplies to support the Missouri bushwhackers and stand Watty's forces in Indian Territory, allowing his men to safely wait out the war. Nathaniel Banks's Red River Campaign forced Smith into action. Defeating Banks and pushing another Federal army back across the Arkansas River drained his supplies and infantry reserves. Worse, lack of other generals meant he'd had to appoint Sterling Price to command in Arkansas. Price remained in Confederate service, though his state guards were long depleted, and he kept insisting that he could reconquer Missouri. Smith openly believed Price couldn't lead a horse to water. The Missouri government in exile was worse. It was continually insisting that Missouri yearned to throw off the federal yoke, if only Confederate troops would come to their rescue. They also claimed that Jefferson Davis fully supported their plan, and were sending Smith orders to reclaim Missouri. Smith knew neither was true. Price launched raids into the state every fall, without provoking additional uprisings or attracting recruits. Davis barely acknowledged Missouri before it was lost, and all Davis ever wanted from Smith was reinforcements. However, he was under increasing pressure from both other state governments and his subordinates to more actively participate in the war, making the Missourians' calls for a liberation campaign unignorable. During July, Joseph Shelby's cavalry crossed the Arkansas River to capture Federal supplies and disrupt communications. Shelby reported that Federal forces were minimal outside of Little Rock and Fort Smith. The route into Missouri was open if Smith wanted to launch a raid. This gave Smith a win-win idea. He didn't believe that Missouri was actually recoverable, but he could use the Missourians' belief that it was so to his advantage. A raid into Missouri, utilizing Price's informant networks, could disrupt the upcoming elections, potentially preventing Missouri from voting for Lincoln, whose defeat was the only remaining hope for a Southern victory. At the very least, it was an opportunity to gather supplies. Missouri might also rise, though Smith was certain it wouldn't. However, Smith would finally be rid of his Missouri headaches. He'd be using all of Price's remaining allies and moving deeper into Missouri than any previous raid. If this didn't cause the mass uprising the government claimed was imminent, it'd prove they were lying and could be ignored henceforth. Price would be going along too, though he wasn't supposed to command. If Price didn't die, he'd either stay in Missouri or return defeated and disgraced. The 4,000 available cavalry and mounted infantry were insufficient for the operation, so Smith told Price to rally the bushwhackers to his cause once inside Missouri. Shelby was directed to recruit more soldiers in northern Arkansas and arm them with captured Federal weapons. The plan immediately went awry. Political optics meant that Price received command of the raid. His perceived incompetence was bad, but his political rivalries and constant bickering with several of his sub-commanders were worse. The government in exile was also going, convincing Smith that the operation was doomed. Price shared Smith's disdain for them and intended to hold elections to replace them. They were coming along to thwart him. Smith wanted to launch the raid in mid-August, but supply problems and political infighting meant Price didn't cross the shallow Arkansas River until September 6th. Shelby joined Price at Pocahontas on September 14th, bringing another 8,000 soldiers, mostly deserters he'd rounded up and forced back into service. 4,000 of them were unarmed, and 1,000 lacked horses. Still, Price's 12,000 raiders moved north on September 19th. The Department of Missouri was aware of Price's activities. However, it was a shadow of its 1862 self. The 4,000 to 8,000 active bushwhackers were a nuisance, but small federal garrisons and 10,000 state militia had proved sufficient to minimize their damage, and their combat troops were reassigned to active theaters. It was the perfect backwater for William Rosecrans to command, while recovering from his mental collapse in Chattanooga. When he learned of Price's advance, Rosecrans raised new volunteer regiments and requested that the 16th Corps be forwarded to St. Louis from across the Mississippi Theater. A general alert was raised and additional reinforcements began marching to Missouri. The federal response was helped by Price having no sense of urgency. Rather than swiftly marching north to St. Louis as planned, Price decided to attack the 1,456-strong garrison at Pilot Knob, thinking it an easy morale-building victory. Price's vanguard encountered Federal scouts on September 26th, and the alerted Federals retreated into Fort Davidson. Price didn't have artillery capable of breaching the walls, so the next day he ordered a series of attacks to overwhelm the fort. Despite overwhelming numbers, his men failed to cross the moat and suffered heavy casualties. Some Federals holding outbuildings were captured and subsequently executed. The heavily outnumbered Federals slipped away in the dark. Price remained near Pilot Knob until September 29th. He had learned that St. Louis was reinforced and no longer a plausible target, so instead he marched for Jefferson City. Approximately 6,000 bushwhackers joined his army, who pillaged the countryside indiscriminately. Price had given orders against looting, but everyone ignored him, and soon a 5,000-strong wagon train followed his army, primarily laden with miscellaneous loot rather than useful military supplies. Rosecrans correctly guessed Price's intentions and reinforced and refortified Jefferson City. Price reached its outskirts on October 7th and realized that taking it was impossible. He began meandering vaguely westward toward Fort Leavenworth, skirmishing with Federal patrols and overwhelming garrisons. However, his nemesis from Pea Ridge was waiting for him. Samuel Curtis commanded the Kansas Department, and when the alert was raised, he mobilized 20,000 volunteers and militia before marching to Kansas City. He and Rosecrans discussed trapping Price between their armies via telegraph, but bushwhackers kept intercepting their messages, making actual coordination impossible. Rosecrans had Alfred Pleasonton's 10,000 cavalry chasing Price, hoping Curtis was ready to block his escape. Curtis fortified Westport to block Price, hoping Rosecrans's troops were still coming. Curtis sent James Blunt's division towards Lexington to suppress bushwhacker activity and locate Price on October 15th. Price was still moving slowly and reached Blunt's position on October 19th. Superior numbers let Price push through, but he finally realized that the Federals were closing in. Blunt decided to hold at Little Blue River, though Curtis couldn't send reinforcements. Price attacked on October 21st, pushing Blunt back from the crossings, then through the streets of Independence. However, Blunt's stand let Pleasanton catch Price. Hoping to defeat his enemies in detail, Price split his army. Shelby's division followed Blunt to Byram's Ford, while Price's rearguard engaged Pleasanton in Independence. The rest headed for Curtis in Westport. Finding Blunt's defenses at the main ford too strong, Shelby instead crossed an unguarded ford to the north, forcing Blunt to retreat to Westport. Pleasanton shattered the rearguard and pursued it toward Byram's Ford. Refusing to flee, Price engaged Curtis on October 23rd so the wagon train could escape capture. Shelby withstood a probing attack from Blunt before counterattacking and nearly taking Westport. However, he ran out of ammunition and was pushed back to heights outside the town. Pleasanton charged the rearguard again and broke through at Byram's Ford. Curtis personally directed a flanking attack through a dry gully, which pushed Price away from Westport toward Pleasanton. Threatened from three sides, Price tried to hold Forest Hill, but a general attack routed his raiders. To escape, Price set the prairie on fire, which prevented immediate pursuit. Blunt and Pleasanton pursued Price first into Kansas, then into Missouri, as he tried to avoid federal garrisons and reach Indian territory. Pleasanton attacked Price 3 times on October 25th, and Blunt hit him again on the 28th, repeatedly devastating his rearguard but failing to stop the retreat. Price returned to Arkansas on December 2nd with less than 6,000 men and fewer supplies than he'd started with. Price claimed the expedition was successful, but Smith knew better and sidelined him, having achieved his strategic objective. Significantly, Price's expedition ended Missouri's guerrilla war. The bushwhacker companies fell apart once Price was beaten. It was now obvious that Missouri was never really a Confederate state. The final confirmation was that Missouri voted overwhelmingly for Lincoln. Vengeful Federal cavalry divisions swiftly hunted down those who tried to keep fighting. There were no further significant engagements in the Trans-Mississippi Department. Across the Mississippi, another foolhardy plan reached its logical conclusion. To recap, Jefferson Davis's delusional optimism was that John Bell Hood's 40,000-strong Army of Tennessee could liberate Tennessee and Kentucky before breaking the siege of Petersburg. It had already gone wrong. Hood did minimal damage to Sherman's supply lines before being chased into Georgia. Sherman sent George Thomas, James Schofield, and 3 corps to Tennessee before returning to Atlanta. Thomas and Schofield were to follow Hood once he returned to Georgia to pursue Sherman, like a sane commander would. If Hood were stupid and/or reckless enough to follow Davis's plans, they'd destroy him. Beauregard was nominally Hood's department commander and knew the plan was doomed. Unable to stop Hood, Beauregard tried to limit the damage and ordered him to leave Joseph Wheeler and William Hardee in Georgia to oppose Sherman and instead used Nathan Forrest's cavalry. However, on October 16th, Forrest launched another grand raid against Sherman's supply lines, which did considerable physical damage without causing any meaningful supply disruptions. The Federals weren't threatened by Forrest anymore. Hood spent October failing to find adequate supplies for his invasion while waiting for Forrest. What little could be found was difficult to move on worn-out rails and unmaintained roads. The Confederacy's infrastructure had crumbled. He impulsively tried to cross the Tennessee River at Decatur, only to be defeated by the Federal garrison. He then moved to Tuscumbia to wait for Forrest. On November 16th, Hood crossed the river. Forrest arrived on the 20th, and the invasion began. Thomas and Schofield had been watching Hood closely, expecting him to chase after Sherman once the march to the sea began. Neither believed Hood would invade Tennessee, despite intelligence stating he would. Nobody was that reckless. Hood's river crossing proved that he was, and Thomas ordered Schofield to consolidate his forces at Columbia. Forrest so effectively screened Hood that Schofield didn't know where Hood was until his breastworks were attacked on November 24th. Schofield realized that this was a pinning attack, enabling Hood to seize the Duck River crossings and isolate him from Thomas, but heavy rains prevented withdrawal until November 29th. Forrest was ahead of Schofield, but he neglected to take the crossroad at Spring Hill, which Federal infantry and cavalry held by noon. Forrest probed but didn't strongly attack their position, instead waiting for infantry support to arrive. Schofield finished withdrawing from Columbia under fire at 1500. Schofield's dispersed army was vulnerable to a coordinated attack, but Hood's subordinates weren't communicating with each other. Hood made it worse by issuing new orders that contradicted their previous orders without consulting or informing them. The confusion prevented any meaningful attack, as Schofield continued his march to Franklin through Hood's lines. Rebel pickets repeatedly tried to raise an alarm, but all the generals were asleep, thinking Schofield trapped. Instead, Schofield was refortifying Franklin by dawn. When Hood discovered Schofield's escape, he furiously blamed everyone but himself and began pursuing. Schofield's baggage train finished crossing the Harpeth River by early afternoon, but since Hood was finally arriving after a forced march, Schofield decided to fight. Confused orders left an isolated division hastily digging trenches in front of the main line. Stating that he'd rather fight against Schofield's trenches than Nashville's defenses, Hood ordered a frontal attack at 1300. His generals desperately tried to talk him out of it, or at least convince him to wait for more artillery to arrive, but Hood wouldn't budge. Sunset was at 1630, and there was no time for anything else. At 1600, Hood's 20,000 men, supported by 2 batteries of artillery, attacked Schofield's 27,000-strong and overwhelmingly artillery-supported Army of the Ohio. The isolated division was quickly overwhelmed, which disorganized the defenses they fled through. This allowed the assault to pierce the Union center, but a swift counterattack repulsed the Confederates in vicious hand-to-hand fighting. All other attacks were ineffective. Schofield pulled out at 2300 to rejoin Thomas per orders, but he didn't need to. The Army of Tennessee was broken. 6 of Hood's generals, including his best division commander, Patrick Cleburne, were dead, and 8 more were wounded. 55 regimental commanders became casualties. He'd suffered at least 4,500 casualties while inflicting only 2,326, which shattered his men's morale. Rather than retreat and risk mass desertion, Hood continued to Nashville. Thomas was securely inside Nashville's extensive fortifications, with 55,000 men supported by federal gunboats when Hood arrived on December 2nd. Unable to credibly besiege Thomas with 25,000 men, but having nothing else to do, Hood dug trenches south of Nashville. Hoping to draw Thomas out, Forrest was sent off on another raid towards Murfreesboro, where he was defeated on December 7th. Grant ordered Thomas to attack and finish off Hood. When nothing happened for 2 weeks, Grant ordered Major General John Logan to relieve Thomas if he didn't attack by December 13th, though Logan got stuck in Louisville. On December 16th, Grant was boarding a train to travel to Nashville personally when news arrived that Thomas had successfully attacked. Thomas knew that Franklin had irreparably broken the Army of Tennessee. However, he expected reinforcements, and his cavalry had performed so poorly thus far that it required retraining to effectively pursue and finish off Hood's army once he attacked. Thomas also wanted hunger and cold to weaken the rebels further, so he waited. On December 15th, Thomas was finally ready. At 1430, Thomas launched a diversionary attack against Hood's right, while the rest of the army stormed 5 redoubts on Hood's left. The rebels were overwhelmed, and Hood retreated into a more compact line on higher ground behind the original line. Thomas repeated the attack the next day, rolling up Hood's left flank and permanently shattering the Army of Tennessee. Thomas pursued Hood, but heavy rain and a determined rearguard, consisting of Hood's only combat-capable units, plus the returned Forrest, let the rebels escape into Alabama. Hood's casualties are disputed, but on January 20th, he reported 18,742 men ready for duty, though other reports claim there were actually fewer than 15,000. The Army of Tennessee was finished as a fighting force. Hood blamed everyone but himself for the disaster before he resigned. The failed 1864 offensives expended the Confederacy's last reserves of men and materiel. Lincoln's re-election, secured in part thanks to Early and Price's defeats, meant there was now no chance for a negotiated peace. There was nothing left to delay the war's endgame. The only question was when, not if, Grant would break Lee at Petersburg, ending the Southern Rebellion for good. Join us next time to answer that question and see the end of the American Civil War. To ensure you don't miss that, make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our patrons and YouTube members can watch more than 200 exclusive videos. Join their ranks via the link in the description or by pressing the join button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.